With the ending of patch 4.3, Final Fantasy XIV closed its Stormblood chapter and began to move towards the story of the next expansion. Patches 4.1 to 4.3 tied up many loose ends concerning Stormblood's remaining villains, and also set up various plot threads and introduced characters that would continue on into the future of the game. The remaining two patches I did not discuss in my previous So I Played Final Fantasy XIV video are patches 4.4 and 4.5, and they're what this video will be focusing on. These two patches begin by simply carrying on the game's narrative as it left off at the end of 4.3, but various supernatural twists during these two patches derailed the story from the simple route it was following, and bring us into the story of the Shadowbringers expansion, a major departure from the story that had been told up until that point. I know that many would prefer I skip straight to Shadowbringers, but patches 4.4 and 4.5 deserve to be recognized, as they are what paves the way to our adventure in Norvrant, and honestly, I need more time to work on that Shadowbringers video. I swear each expansion I cover, the videos get longer. Anyway, this video will cover my thoughts and experiences with Final Fantasy XIV patches 4.4 and 4.5, and of course it will contain spoilers for the story within these patches, so if you wish to avoid spoilers, feel free to click off the video. It'll still be here after you play through this part of the game for yourself. But without any further ado, as always, my name is Lokidum, and welcome to So I Played Final Fantasy XIV, Prelude and Violet, and Requiem for Heroes. Released on September 18th of 2018, Final Fantasy XIV Patch 4.4 Prelude and Violet brought a lot of instance content for all levels of players, from dungeons and trials and even the final Omega Raid tier. Along with that content, there was many rebalances and additions to side content. All in all, this is a big patch for the PvE, crafting, and gathering crowds, so 99% of the player base. Sorry PvP players, you'll get some love in 6.0. On the MSQ side of things, we immediately receive a summons from the Alliance leaders about the possibility of once again having to deal with the Ascians' plots in the future. So Alizain, the Warrior of Light, prepare to leave, only to receive an important message from Thancred, who had attained info about the Garleans and beckons to do to Alamigo to meet with him. Once they are reunited, Thancred fills them in about his reconnaissance mission where he discovered that the rebellions of Alamigo and Doma had caused a chain reaction, and many other Imperial provinces have attempted their own rebellions, to variable success. During his missions, Thancred almost managed to confirm that Xenos' body was indeed being occupied by an Ascian, and he also notes that no word of Alphinaud arriving in Garlemald was ever received. This of course being because his ship crashed into the burn, but they don't know that yet. All they had received was a hazy message through Link Pearl mentioning the burn, so the group heads to Othard and stops in Doma to petition Lord Hien's aid, who happily agrees to help rescue Alphinaud. The group rides into the burn, only for the Warrior of Light to become separated in a sandstorm, dropping the player into the MSQ dungeon for this patch, which of course is named The Burn. This is a very solid dungeon mechanically, and it has a relatively challenging final boss, but the highlight of this dungeon is the vistas and landscapes that are everywhere. If you've been watching this series since it started, you'd know that I absolutely adore barren and deserted landscapes, and well, barren and deserted is probably the best way to describe the burn. Being as the lore behind this area is that the ether in this region had all dissipated, and all life inside of the area had perished, leaving behind rolling hills of white dust littered with relics of the Garlean Empire and the corpses of massive beasts that used to call the area home. While some may call it boring, I love looking out at the vast and beautiful nothingness, and no matter what your character is glamored to look like, you always look way more badass in the burn, especially if you're wearing things that look frayed and kinda edgy to begin with. Sorry, I don't make the rules here. After defeating the final boss, the Warrior of Light is reunited with their fellows and they come across a crashed Imperial ship, the very same one that Alphinaud had left Castrum Fluminous in. While there is no sign of Alphinaud, the bodies of the Garlean soldiers that litter the sands tell the story. With no objective left to accomplish in the burn, the Warrior of Light and co decide to return to Doma. Upon returning, the Scions are invited to sit on a meeting with a visitor who happens to be Lys, who is in Doma to discuss Ascians and formally welcome Doma to the Eorzean Alliance. You know, despite the country of Doma and the continent of Othard being separated by Eorzea by a giant roadblock known as Ilzabard. But I doubt Lys is aware of that. Stormblood made it quite clear she isn't exactly the smartest person on the source. After this meeting, we receive a lore dump about Hien's desire to form an Othard-based alliance, the state of affairs between Doma and Garlemald, and some information about Allagan tech that led to the burn becoming the desolate land it is. However, this tech could be used to their advantage, as the Allagans conveniently left behind a giant barrier that could stop Garleans from crossing the burn, thus stopping them from reaching Doma. While this would require a ludicrous amount of power, there is conveniently a place where they can easily attain such a fuel source. And it is also conveniently close by, just to the north in the Azim Steppe. Man, I love plot convenience, but that can be forgiven as we go to my favorite looking dungeon to my favorite looking zone in the game in literally 2 quests. Once they reach the steppe, Hien shares an old Zayla fable about outsiders who attempted to use the power that they planned to claim, and that legend has made the area into a holy ground of sorts for the Zayla tribes. And if the Warrior of Light and Co. tried to take that power, they would find themselves shunned by all of the Zayla, and the alliance of Hien's dream would never come to be. Well, I immediately thought we could simply fight the Zayla for the power and leave with no harm to Doma and the Zayla's political relationship, Hien and the others decided to go about things peacefully. And a right shame that is. I was ready and raring for an Adam 2.0. Our party first decides to speak to, or rather suck up to, the Dothrall tribe, who is fine with the heroes using the power on one condition. Sadu, who is the leader of the tribe, wants to fight the Warrior of Light once more. She may be pretty crazy, but I like the way she does things. So, the battle begins, and as expected of Sadu, she makes enough noise that she manages to attract the attention of Magnai, the leader of the Azim tribe and Othard's most bombastic narcissist. Once arrived, the overconfident Zayla proceeds to jerk off his own ego and declares that only he can decide the fate of the power, and if the Zayla will join Hien's Dream Alliance. Fuck this guy. Seriously. Fuck this guy. Hien and Y'shtola manage to stop Magnai from interrupting the warrior and Sado's duel, and both Sadu and Magnai proceed to get their ass kicked. Also, we get to fight as Y'shtola during part of the sequence, and this is the only time I have ever, and probably will ever, play a cat girl in this game. My review? They're too short. No, I do not have a height complex, I just always play a tall character. Shit. Maybe I do have a height complex. Once we have, of course, emerged victorious, Magnai suddenly declares his love for Y'shtola and proposes marriage, only for Y'shtola to knock him down more than a few pegs by effectively calling Mr. Big Man on campus a little kid. Man, I wish when I played through this part of the game 8 months ago I had recorded my reaction, because this honestly had me rolling. After this hilarious interaction, the group goes to the cave where the powerful crystal of their desire lays in wait, and Y'shtola uses her power to channel the surplus of ether within the crystal into the burn, providing power to the Allegan barrier. However, before we can return to the burn, Hien receives the results of his alliance propositions to find that many have been accepted, while few declined. While not parsing quite as high as he would have liked to, Hien is happy with the results and states he feels comfortable about Othard's defenses, enough so to allow himself to travel to Alamigo to meet the other leaders of the alliance. The Scions and Hien go to Alamigo where they sit down for a meeting with the other leaders. Everyone around the table trades information and discusses strategies for how to deal with the inevitable threat of Garlemald and the Ascians, and also what they want to do about the possessed corpse of Xenos who is set to move against them at a moment's notice. While listening to the other leaders discuss, all of the Scions suddenly feel sharp pain through their head and the Warrior of Light feels themselves dragged into a dark void where they hear a voice echo through the abyss. The voice cautions that history must be changed lest the world will be met with a flood of light that consumes all. The voice then starts to plead with the warrior and beckons them to throw open the gates. As soon as this voice ends and the warrior is returned to the real world, Thegard collapses in a coma and is unable to be revived. Worried about this event, the Scions rush back to the Rising Stones to speak with Urianger, who confirms he has also heard the voice. But before they could discuss further, the voice rings out once more, begging again for the gates to be thrown open. When this second bout of the voice subsides, Urianger and Y'shtola have also collapsed. Alisaie starts to fall apart, knowing not of her brother's fate, and losing the other Scions leaves the normally headstrong and resilient girl vulnerable and scared. Two things that are like oil and water to Alisaie's normal personality. The young Elzin takes the warrior to Limsa to meet with Gabu in order to check up on his well-being, only to find that the poor kobold had not yet recovered since the events with Titan, though he had not gotten any worse. This gives Alisaie at least a little bit of hope and she proceeds to bare her soul to the Warrior of Light, begging them to promise not to leave her. The warrior does their best to comfort her, but you can tell it isn't enough. Meanwhile, deep within Imperial territory, Shadowhunter and Alphino arrive at a resistance camp to find all of the soldiers dead with no sign of resistance. While Alphino is confused, Shadowhunter informs him of a bioweapon that the Empire had once been developing called Black Rose. They both come to the conclusion of Ascian involvement before deciding to move out. The final scene of the patch depicts a conversation between the corpse of Xenos and the Emperor. Corpse Xenos reveals that he is truly the Ascian Elidibus and encourages the Emperor to simply give the word and use the full force of the Empire to crush Alamigo. The Emperor refuses, much to Elidibus' displeasure. Elidibus leaves and the Emperor is taunted by another voice, informing him that Garlemald's only purpose is to maintain the balance of light and darkness within the source. The source of this voice then appears and reveals itself to be Solus Van Galvis, Xenos' great-grandfather and the late founder of the Garlean Empire. While he is supposed to have died an old man, before us we see the founder as a young man, the spitting image of himself in his younger years. Turns out the founding father of Garlemald is an Ascian himself, and he founded Garlemald simply to obey the Ascians. The current Emperor shoots Solus, only for the Ascian to reappear in a dark cloud and mock Varus some more before finally taking his own leave. So that was patch 4.4, which is an extremely dense patch and once again could have been split into two with the amount of story content there was within it. This patch goes from trying to set up alliances and defend the nations to suddenly having the Scions collapse as a voice rings out, and the revelations about Garlemald are figurative bombshells. So many things are covered in this patch, it's staggering, and it all goes down in just 7 quests. But overall, this is a great patch that is highly engaging and rewarding for the time spent on the story up to that point. And the patch itself is aptly named, for this is indeed the start of the Prelude to Shadowbringers. Patch 4.5 or Requiem for Heroes arrived on January 8th of 2019 and brought with it new MSQ quests along with the new MSQ dungeon, some gold saucer updates in Doman Mahjong and Air Force 1, the last 24-man raid of Stormblood, a new CNE trial, a new Eureka Zone, world visit, and the Blue Mage limited job. The story starts out with Alisaie and the Warrior of Light worrying over the condition of the other Scions, and their worries only grow after Kryle's examination leaves her stumped, saying that it was like their very souls were drawn from their bodies. Thinking they may be able to track down these lost souls the same way as they had found Thancred during the Dragonsong War patches, they headed to Dravania to once again request the aid of Master Matoya, who once learning that Y'shtola was also affected happily lends them the Crystal Eye. But the situation only worsens as Kryle finishes using the eye, finding that the Ether Trail leads only to an abrupt end rather than leading into the Ethereal Sea. Not giving them any time to contemplate, Alisaie receives an urgent message via Link Pearl that a group of Imperials had defected to Alamigo, among them the Garlean Maxima, who Alphinaud had left with at the end of 5.3. The warrior and Alisaie rush to Garabania, and once there, Alisaie immediately begins interrogating Maxima about her brother. The man claims that after the Shadow Hunter led them out of the burn, Alphinaud had chosen to follow the mysterious man on his missions rather than return to Alamigo with Maxima's group. The Garlean then proceeds to volunteer information about dealings within the Empire, where instead of simply putting down the rebellions that were rising up across of it, they had instead been using bioweapons that could swiftly fell an entire army. With their forces not being needed to fight against the smaller rebellions, the Empire had chosen to send their forces westward towards Alamigo. This info is enough to set Lyse and Raubon into a panic. Knowing that their defenses would not be ready in time, the other alliance leaders are quickly called upon in an effort to stall for time as long as possible by negotiating with the Imperials before inevitably jumping into action against them. Things are moving at light speed in Garabania, and Alisaie and the Warrior of Light are asked to journey to Doma and inform Hien of all the news from Alamigo. Doma must not have a link shell network, cause otherwise I don't see any reason for journeying so far. Anyway, before they can leave, the two remaining Scions are hit with another bout from the mysterious voice calling to them once more to throw open the gates, though luckily this time neither of them succumbed and managed to stay alert. Once in Doma, the Warrior and Alisaie are introduced to the other alliance leaders in Hien's alliance, and they are brought along to test the Allagan barrier left in the burn. Hien, the Warrior, Alisaie, and folks from Garland Ironworks fly out to the burn and activate the barrier successfully, watching the wall fly into the sky over 15,000 yalms, and as if on cue, an Imperial lander suddenly shows up. As it is not able to break through the wall, it chooses to land and Shadow Hunter emerges, carrying an unconscious Alphinaud in his arms. The Warrior makes eye contact and recognizes the man immediately, the man who was once a puppet to the Ascians, whom had caused devastation beyond his intention. The Black Wolf himself. Turns out the Shadow Hunter was none other than Gaius Van Baelsar. While the warrior readies for a battle, Gaius begins to calmly explain how he survived the events in the Praetorium, his desire for vengeance against the Ascians, and what he had been doing since. The warrior stands down as Gaius begins to share his findings about the Ascians and how their hierarchy works. This is all very interesting stuff if you are into the lore like I am, but for this kind of video it's really unnecessary bloat, so I'm gonna skip over it. The only really important thing he talks about is the bioweapon Black Rose, and how he and Alphinaud had managed to dismantle the factory creating it. Also, that they had found a massive Allagan cloning lab full of young Emperor Solus clones, so what turns out to be just bags of flesh for the Ascian to control. Soon enough, the Warrior, Alisaie, and Hien all head towards Alamigo now that the barrier is enabled, and they reach Garabania just in time to be dragged into a meeting between the Eorzean Alliance and the Emperor of Garlemald himself. As expected, the negotiations go pretty badly, with every single criticism on either side being turned around to the other side, and talks start to break down before Alisaie forces a recess. Once both sides return to the table, the Alliance asks the Emperor why he is waging the war, to which he explains that he wishes to reunite the other shards with the Source, brought about by multiple rejoinings. Emperor Varus then volunteers the information that the Empire was founded by an Ascian for the very purpose of carrying out this plot. Varys then extends an offer to join him, which of course is promptly refused, and the negotiations come to an end. Now, I have to applaud Varys' acting here, because while he is regurgitating this Ascian plot, he does so in a tone that is almost mocking of the idea, and like he couldn't really believe it himself. It's pretty obvious to anyone who looks that Varys does not like the Ascians and their plans and wishes to go against them. But he doesn't exactly have a choice, because if he wants to go to bed with his head still on his shoulders, he has to do what they tell him to. Varys isn't speaking in his own words here, and since the player knows this already, seeing how he repeats the plan gives a deeper insight into what Varys wants and who he is as a character. But anyway, back to the story. Now that any chance of peace between Eorzea and Garlemald has been thoroughly executed, the battle finally begins in the dungeon of the Gimlet Dark, where the Warrior of Light rushes through the trenches and through what is truly hell on earth in order to push back the advancing Garlean forces. This is a really cool dungeon and a great way to end off the instant's content in the Stormblood MSQ. The dungeon is eerie and unsettling in design and theme, forcing 4 players through winding trenches and bloody battlefields, chopping through Garlean troops and tech. We also get to see our allies from all the way back in ARR all fighting alongside us within the dungeon, and we charge areas along with them. The music uses the main Stormblood themes in many ways, going from more triumphant to fit the battle, and more somber as if reflecting how we got all the way to this point since stepping out of a cart in one of the 3 ARR city-states. This dungeon is just a great way to end Stormblood and the 4.x patches. With victory achieved in the Gimlet Dark, the initial assault is pushed back, and Alisaie and the Warrior Light plan to keep moving forward, but once again the voice rings out, and struggle as she might, Alisaie finally succumbs to the voice. I was actually really upset about this when I was playing through this part of the game blind, as she was the one that made us promise not to leave her side, and she just promptly ditches us. Promises mean nothing in this game unless they involve war or vengeance. But anyway, the warrior rushes her back to the Rising Stones. Meanwhile, Elidibus in the flesh of Xenos descends onto the battlefield. The Warrior of Light soon returns to the Almegan front, and after discussion about strategy with Raubon, the voice once again calls to and beckons the Warrior of Light to throw open the gates. They manage to retain their composure just in time to hear that Xenos has broken through the Almegan defenses, and the warrior immediately takes off to confront Elidibus' flush bag. As the warrior makes their way over, we get to take control of many of our allies, who were all defeated quite swiftly by Elidibus. When the warrior finally arrives and the duel begins, Elidibus makes the mistake of underestimating them, and ends up having trouble maintaining his defenses. Soon enough, he falls, though thanks to being an Ascian, he's able to resurrect himself on the spot, and finds himself completely refreshed. Elidibus then makes short work of the now exhausted Warrior of Light, and right as he is about to bring down his blade, the voice pierces the warrior's mind once more. Perfect timing. The warrior is once again pulled into the ethereal realm and finds himself face to face with the source of the voice. The man who is the source of the voice proceeds to tell the warrior that the current conflict is irrelevant, as both paths lead to oblivion for the source. He then invites the warrior to journey to the First, one of the 13 shards that split from the source, promising that they will find a true path forward in that world. They then employ the Warrior of Light to find the beacon they left for them at the base of the Crystal Tower. The warrior finally awakes, but instead of being at the end of a katana's blade, they find themselves awake in a bed in Ishgard. Imrik then comes in and confirms that the events of Stormblood and the 4.x patches were not just a nightmare, and that Estinian had managed to save the warrior at the last second before being executed by Elidibus, though now the former Zir Dragoon was MIA. Yet, not all news was bad, as the conflict ended in a stalemate with neither side advancing, which served as a morale boost for the other rebellions. We then see a scene of an argument between Emperor Varys and Elidibus, where we find out that Solus has vanished and that Varys is determined to work against the Ascians' plans and use the Empire to further his own goals. The warrior returns to the Rising Stones, and after a discussion with their fellow Scions about recent events and their meeting with the voice, they theorize that the First is where the souls of the other Scions had been whisked away to, and thus the warrior resolves to follow the instructions of the voice and venture to the First themselves. The patch ends with the Warrior of Light atop a peak staring at the Crystal Tower. While falling to the final 2 patch curse of being extremely dense and sometimes scatterbrained, this is overall a great patch that properly moves the player into the next part of the game relatively smoothly, considering how big of a transition it is narratively from Stormblood to Shadowbringers. This patch also achieves a great balance between action, general dialogue, and politics, making it among the top patches for FF14 story-wise in my opinion. It all moves quite fast, but not at an unreasonable pace, and it flows extremely well, especially the latter part of the patch. include the big reveals that were present and the continued exploration of other plotlines, and it makes a pretty damn hard to beat X.5 patch. The latter half of the 4.x patches are solid additions to the game, and personally I think that they easily beat out the first 3 patches of the Stormblood expansion. While those patches still have individual moments that beat out much of these patches, aka Castrum Fluminous, Prelude and Violet and a Requiem for Heroes are far more engaging as a whole. They have a better flow to them, and they tell a story that finally takes advantage of the relationships between the individual Scions rather than the organization as a whole. We also get to see the return of unexpected characters, namely Gaius Van Baelsar, who was seemingly dead, along with introducing new characters that would become fan favorites, the names of which I won't say right now as they are not canonically known at this point in the story. But there isn't much more to say really, or at least not that I can think of. And well, there is a rather large shadow looming over this section of the video, so I'm just gonna end it there. As always, my name is Lokidum, I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching.
Oh, do not look at me so.
You're slaves to a tyrant. There's no freedom in that.
This is one battle you cannot fight. Away with you.
Your spirited appearance always comes in well good. We did everything right. Everything that was asked of us, and still it came to this.
Your time has not yet come.
From endless dreams I awake. Something vague, yet urgent, calls me to action once more. Dizzying heights it rises, the gleaming spire, its tip threatening to pierce the blinding canopy. There, it will all begin anew, between dark and light, the pure and the corrupt, the one true struggle.